Hello learners, let us now do a poem written by an 18th century poet, Robert Burns. The title of the poem is A Red, Red Rose. It's a love poem written to be sung. It is based on a folk version of an old song Burns had heard on his travels. The poem is written in an English dialect called Scots for publication in a collection of traditional Scottish ballads. This dialect contains words which are not often used in standard English. Robert Burns spent the last 10 years of his life travelling all over Scotland, collecting and editing songs for the Scots Musical Museum, an anthology intended to preserve traditional forms of old Scottish lyrical poetry. During this period, he also composed over 300 original works. Most of these were songs which relied heavily upon traditional folk culture of Scotland. A Red, Red Rose is one such poem. It is intended to be sung. A Red, Red Rose is one such poem. It was first published in 1794 in a selection of Scots songs published by Peter Urbany. It is more often read as a poem today than heard as a song. It pieces together conventional ideas and images in a manner that transcends the non-literary sources from which the poem is drawn. The speaker first compares his love to a red, red rose, and then with a melody that's sweetly played in tune. These comparisons are the typical fodder for love song lyricists across the ages, but the second and third stanzas introduce subtler elements and more complex implications of time. The speaker compares his beloved to a red rose. It is beautiful, but the nature of the beauty is transient. It decays with time. In trying to quantify his feelings and find the perfect metaphor to express the eternal nature of his love, the poet then uses another simile, that of a melody that is sweetly played in tune. The speaker compares his love first with a blooming rose and then with a melody that is sweetly played in tune. If these similes seem trite and the typical fodder for love song lyricists, the second and the third stanzas introduce subtler elements. They bring in more complex implications of time. In trying to quantify his feelings and searching for the perfect metaphor to describe the eternal nature of his love, the poet inevitably comes up against the question of time. The expression Sands of Time, with its image of the hourglass, forces the reader to think about and reassess the first and loveliest image of the poem, that of a red, red rose. While the red rose is an embodiment of physical beauty, it is transient in nature. It decays with time. This treatment of time and beauty by Robert Burns has greatly influenced Romantic poets of the later times. It is often said that Burns was ahead of his time. He used the common language to reach the common people, just slightly before the Romantic movement has swept the globe. Critics often point out that the poem has an autobiographical element. It is therefore interesting to take a quick look into his life. Robert Burns was born in 1759 in Scotland. His father was a poor tenant farmer. He tutored his children at home and tried his best to provide additional education to the best of his ability as his meagre resources allowed. Burns was an avid reader and acquired a good knowledge of English before he went on to study the poetry of his Scottish heritage. During his early years, Burns endured a lot of hard work and tried to cope with the worsening financial situation of his family. They had to move from one rented farm to another. Burns, as a young man, had great charm and wit. He was also involved in several love affairs. This brought him into conflict with the Presbyterian Church. The church was also angered by his criticism and opposition of several accepted beliefs. Some of these accepted beliefs that Burns opposed were the concept of predestination and also the inherent sinfulness of the human being. Burns considered these beliefs incompatible with human nature. In his late 20s, Burns proposed marriage to Jane Armour, who was pregnant with his twins. Her parents strongly opposed this idea and rejected his offer and sought financial restitution. Burns then determined to sail to the West Indies. However, successful publication of a collection of his poems at that time made him change his mind. Instead of sailing to the West Indies, he decided to go to Edinburgh. At Edinburgh, he was hugely popular among the literary circles there. At Edinburgh, Burns met James Johnson, a printer who was interested in collecting and publishing all the traditional folk songs of Scotland. Burns then travelled all across Scotland collecting songs. In this process, he collected and also wrote several new songs. Most of the songs he collected were either edited or revised by him. A Red, Red Rose is one of the songs written originally by Burns. One of the consequences of his journeys across Scotland was his rise to national prominence and popularity. He later married Jane Armour, his lady love, and lived happily with her. He divided his time between writing poetry and farming until he obtained a government position about 3 years after his marriage. He died rather young in the year 1796. Perhaps one of the reasons why his poetry has a fresh energy and youthful vitality is because he did not live to be old. Now let's attempt a brief summary of the poem. You might wonder why such a short and simple poem as A Red, Red Rose needs to be summarized at all. However, the process of summarizing encourages you to look into all the minor details that you might have missed otherwise. The poem begins with a comparison of the speaker's beloved to a beautiful red rose. This comparison does appear very commonplace, and one wonders why such cliched expressions and comparisons are used by the poet. Though the similes used appear cliched, a closer reading reveals subtleties. Why, for instance, do you think the word red is repeated? The answer may be found in the very next line. Newly sprung, the rose is fresh and beautiful. It is in its most perfect form. Yet, this embodiment of physical beauty is not lasting. It is transient in nature. Like the beautiful red rose that is freshly sprung in June, the beloved's beauty also is transient. It cannot remain frozen in time. It decays with age. All forms of physical beauty are passing. Perhaps it is this very transient nature of the beautiful rose that compels the poet to pursue another metaphor to express the eternal nature of his love. He now compares his love to a beautiful melody that is sweetly played in tune. The beauty of a melody remains fresh forever. It evokes a feeling of joy each time it is heard or even remembered. It does not age with time. Here, perhaps the poet is implying a transition in the nature of his love from the physical plane to something much more deep. In the second and third stanzas, the speaker professes his lasting love, while the expression, the sands of time, reminds us that time on this earth is short. The speaker goes on to express his lasting love. He declares that he loves her till the end of time, till the seas run dry and the rocks melt with the sun. In the final stanza, the speaker bids his lady love a fond farewell. He tells her that he needs to go away for a while, but he assures her that he is sure to return, even if he has to travel 10,000 miles. Burns clearly states and restates the theme. The speaker loves the young lady beyond measure. It goes without saying that the theme of love has a universal appeal. In this poem, Burns tells us what the epitome of love is to him. The poem depicts the grandeur of love. It also shows how beautiful and precious love is. The poet asserts that love is not a fleeting passion. It is something that goes beyond the limits of time and distance. However near or far the lovers may be, love continues to remain forever. Let us now read the poem aloud. It is an important and useful exercise because reading poetry is not just reading it, it is an experience. A poem has to be experienced at different levels. Reading it aloud enhances our appreciation of its musical quality. A red, red rose. Oh, my love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. Oh, my love's like the melody that's sweetly played in tune. As fair art thou, my bonny lass, so deep in love am I. And I will love thee still, my dear, till all the seas gang dry, my dear, and the rocks melt with the sun. I will love thee still, my dear, while the sands of life shall run. And fare thee weel, my only love, and fare thee weel a while. And I will come again, my love, though it were 10,000 miles. I hope you have noticed that the poem is written in four-line stanzas. Four-line stanzas are called quatrains. Here you find that in each stanza, tetrameter and trimeter lines alternate. Quatrains written in this form are called ballad verse. The ballad is an old form of verse adopted for singing and recitation. It originated in the days when poetry was sung more than read. The ballad form often portrays both ideas and feelings in overwrought but simplistic terms. A ballad is casually referred to as a story poem. A red, red rose does not narrate a story, but when you look at it again, maybe it does. It perhaps narrates the story of love, love for all times. A discussion of poetic devices is inevitable to our appreciation of any poem. The poet uses similes and hyperbolic expressions. A simile is a figure of speech that has an explicit comparison. The poet uses words of comparison such as like or as. The first stanza of the poem has two straightforward similes, which we have already discussed. A hyperbole is an expression of exaggeration. The poet uses several hyperboles here. To convey the lasting nature of his love, he assures his lady love that he would love her till the seas gang dry and the rocks melt with the sun. Now, aren't these hyperboles? He also tells her that he wouldn't mind traveling 10,000 miles to meet her again. That is another example of a hyperbole. Rhyme adds to the musical quality of a poem. In this poem, we find that the second and the fourth lines in every stanza have an end rhyme. In the third and fourth stanzas, the first and the third lines have end rhyme too. Alliteration is repetition of consonant sounds at the beginning of words in a line. We find alliteration right in the first line of the poem, a red, red rose. The dominant meter in the poem is iambic. In iambic meter, we have pairs of unstressed and stressed syllables. A tetrameter line has 4 such pairs. A trimeter line has 3 pairs. Each pair is referred to as a foot, and that is how a tetrameter line has 4 feet and a trimeter line has 3 feet. Let's take a look at how this pattern of unstressed and stressed syllables goes. As fair art thou, my bonny lass, so deep in love am I. In these 2 lines, as fair art thou, my bonny lass, so deep in love am I. Each line begins with an unstressed syllable and the pattern goes on. The poem and its poet enjoy immense popularity even today. This poem in song form has been performed by a range of artists even in the 20th and 21st centuries. When asked about the source of his greatest creative inspiration, American singer-songwriter Bob Dylan selected A Red, Red Rose as the lyrics that have been the greatest inspiration of his life. Critics discuss A Red, Red Rose in terms of the delicacy of its craft and the power of its expression. Franklin Bliss Snyder sees this poem as an example of Burns' proficiency at English verse, calling it one of the perfectly cut and polished gems in Burns' song collection. The critic points out that 4 touches of the vernacular, bonny, gang, awe, and wheel, are all that save the song from being pure English. Ian Crichton Smith refers to the poem as an example of the sentiments of a bygone era. David Daches, in his work, describes Burns as the greatest songwriter Britain has produced for his work in refurbishing and improving traditional Scots songs, including A Red, Red Rose, which he described as a combination of tenderness and swagger. It seems extremely clinical to examine something as tender and beautiful as A Red, Red Rose and subject it to the scrutiny of critical consideration. But reading the opinions and observations of critics does deepen your understanding of the poem. The poem itself is so delicately wrought that it is like a frail rose. One image flows into the next, and picture by picture forms a beautiful short poem that is a wonderful addition to the ongoing tradition of love poetry. The poem is enchantingly melodious, simple, yet sensuous. There are many facets to the emotion of love. This particular poem is not about burning desire or passionate love. It is a sweet and romantic poem that stirs up feelings of tenderness and lasting love. As you grow to experience life in all its fullness, your understanding of love deepens as well. Love will not continue to remain just on the physical plane, but transcends it to go into the intellectual and spiritual planes. Every human being aspires to achieve divine bliss through love. The human quest for love is eternal and unending. Love poetry, therefore, knows no bounds. So read on, dear learners. Thank you.